So just maybe to cap that off a bit, I will say that, well, because this is relevant as well to assessing the merits of the competing theories. I think one of the fundamental problems with idealism is that it does reduce a lot of our experiences to brute facts. Now, your particular version of idealism is a bit different there because it's objective idealism. So there's further issues there. But so, for example, if you want to say that material reality as we know it is a bundle of properties or an emergent phenomena or something in God's mind, you still have to have all of the regularities and posits that the physicalist would have to. You have to say, look, there's some sort of fundamental quantum substrate, or at least the appearance of that exists in God's mind, and it behaves particular regularities. Space-time emerges from that. In God's mind, it behaves regularities as well. Like all of the regularities of physics have to hold. But the question is, why do they hold? It seems that they just hold because God wants them to hold, and he could just as easily want them to not hold or to hold sometimes. It seems to me that it's just a postulate that at any given time, God wants these regularities to hold. Whereas the physicalist has an explanation for this, in that these are direct descriptions, or at least approximate descriptions, of the way reality just is. And so they couldn't just change at some time, whereas they could if they were in God's mind, right? Because he could just want something to be different at any time, or imagine it being different. So I think that's a lot simpler, because you don't have all these brute facts that just says, well, God wants the appearance to stay that way at all of these different points in times.
So are you a necessitarianism? Would you say that everything is like necessary as is and there's no mere possibility?
No, I don't have very strong views about modality, but I wouldn't say that, no.
Okay, yeah, I mean, Oppie, for example, talks about that as being an issue. But I mean, like, even so, if you're not, then even on a materialistic understanding, you still have to posit the idea that there is this probability out there. So, for example, classical physics is, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's classical physics is not the way it necessarily has to be. Because it's necessary. It's contingent. There's a probability field regarding the certain number of universes out there. So, I mean, if you're not a necessitarianism and you don't have a perfect foundation, the universe selection pressures would just remain unexplained on naturalism. It's just not the way it is. Why did it have to be a certain way? My basic point is the laws of nature are just the way they are in your view because of a brute fact. So I don't see how that's not somehow different from me, because you still have a probability you need to calculate into the naturalistic worldview and to terms of what God's actions would be like similar.
Well, the difference I see it is that, yes, I have to either give an explanation or just say that there is no explanation for, why, say, material reality is the way it is, why quantum structure this way, not the other way. But the theistic idealist has to do that as well. But they also have to say why it's consistent. So once you have an ontology, you say, look, we've got a bunch of quantum fields or something like that behave this way. That's part of their essence, right? That's just what they do. They're not just going to suddenly do something different. So you don't have to explain the consistency of that. You've got initial postulates or initial contingencies or whatever it is, and then that's all there is to it. But under theistic idealism, you've got, well, why does all of that behave that way? But at the next instant in time, or I don't know, different part of the universe or whatever, it could just be completely different, because in God's mind, it can be whatever. Like, there's no one substance or set of substances that are fundamental that give rise to all of the other aspects of reality. It could be like that if God wanted to, but he could decide that he doesn't want it like that anymore, or it's like that in one part of space but not the other, or one part of time and not the other. It seems to me that it's all contingency after contingency, because God could imagine or emerge it up or think up whatever he wants. The materialist doesn't have that problem, because all of reality is given by the underlying ontological substances that exist, and that they just have the properties that they have, and they're not just going to spontaneously do something different. But that could happen in God's simulation of reality, it seems to me.
Well, hold on. Why couldn't you? You admit you're not necessitarian. Maybe there's like the initial quantum state could just, or maybe the laws could just sort of change. I mean, Leonard Susskind posits that maybe the laws of nature are different, or the observable universe is much bigger, or the actual universe is what he says is bigger than the observable universe, and the laws of nature he posits could be different in other places and whatnot. It sounds exactly the same to me. But the difference is you're positing multiple brute facts. I'm saying all of this reduces to God's actual foundation. No.
It's clearly not. It's clearly not reducible to God's. So does God, under your view, does God have a choice about the constants of nature, or the laws by which the simulated universe operates? Or is that all necessarily following from his nature?
No, the laws of nature don't have to be the way they have to be.
Yeah, right. So that's all the same level of brute fact that I'm describing. But I think the difference is okay, so let's suppose there's a multiverse, right? And that there's different laws of physics, or different constants, at least, in different like parts or branches of the universe. Sure, that could happen. But that is still, or at least the postulate, what I'm saying is, we don't know, right? But it's the postulate that would be ultimately describable in terms of, let's say, the properties of underlying, let's say, quantum substrate. Again, we don't know the exact words to use there, but like there's some underlying set of properties that reality has on the basis of just what it is, and maybe that can give rise to different branches of the universe with different constants or whatever. But it can't just do anything, right? It's restricted by what properties it has. Whereas God's simulation can literally do anything logically possible because it's just a simulation in God's mind. So I think that you have a lot more explaining to do as to why we see what we do see, and more brute facts to postulate that God wants it this way or that way or the other way.
Well, just because a mind can have a complicated thought, that doesn't mean it entails a complicated ontology. What you're positing is a very complicated ontology, this underlying substance that somehow is a certain way it is. It has no internal nature to explain why it is that certain way, just sort of accepted on a brute fact. And this is why I quoted like people like Eric, or like Lepto and Byerly, who point out that the internal nature on a theistic foundation can explain its own necessity. Whereas on the other view, we have to accept all these various brute facts, that certain things are the way they are, that certain laws of nature just are the way they certain are. Now, I agree that the laws of nature are a contingency, but I'm not positing that that's just the way it has to be because it is. I'm saying the foundation would be a perfect being. And he can, of course, explain. Now, what I'm getting at is that the internal nature of the agency can explain that specific foundation. It's a lot less complicated of an ontology versus just positing some sort of undetectable material substance that just is a certain way that a certain is, brings about natural knowledge a certain way it is. There's just multiple brute facts being posited here.
Again, I think I think maybe we should move on soon, but maybe just go for a little bit longer.
Yeah, because I got a question regarding that anyway, so.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about some of the evidence you give in favor of emergentism, which I think is important. But let's just maybe finish this off for a few minutes. So first of all, I don't think I'm postulating undetectable substances. I mean, it depends what you mean by undetectable, but we're both scientific realists, so we're both happy to read off, to some extent, in some sense, an ontology or a reality underpinning the scientific equation. So we're both doing that. So I don't think that there's a difference there. The question is the plausibility or the simplicity and so forth of what we're postulating. So now there's a question about the contingency of what happens in reality. Now, I'm happy to say that maybe there's brute facts, maybe there's brute contingencies, maybe necessariatism is necessary. It's a hard word. Necessariatism is true. I'm not sure about that, right? But my point is that I think there's a symmetry there, because whatever I say about the underlying basis of why the material world is the way it is, the theist has to have a similar story. You can't derive all of that from God's nature, and you've just agreed with that, because none of that follows from God's necessary nature. So sure, God may exist necessarily. Of course, I could just postulate something that exists necessarily as well to get around that. But I'm just going to put that to the side and just say, okay, God might exist necessarily, but all of the aspects of the material world or the emergent universe that exists in God's mind, none of those follow necessarily. They all have to be postulated. But I think that there's an additional issue here, because you need to also postulate as to why it doesn't change arbitrarily, or why miracles don't occur more often. Everything that occurs in God's mind is, I think, a contingent fact, or possibly a brute fact, about what God wants there to be in his simulation, because it could be different, right? And that's the key point. Anything that happens in God's mind could be different, as long as it's logically possible, because God could imagine it up whatever way he wants. That just isn't true in the reductive materialist worldview, because once you've got the initial substrate, what follows is required by the properties or the nature of that substrate. That just isn't true in God's simulation.
Well, I don't think that every thought sort of has to be a brute fact. I don't think that follows at all, and that's what like Lepto example was talking about.
But of course it could, because it could be different. At least contingent. I'm not necessarily saying brute facts.
Things, but by that logic, then every single action that has ever existed in a naturalistic worldview would also just have to be a brute fact.
No, because they follow necessarily. It depends if you think that there's quantum indeterminacy, right? So we have to. But that again, that applies in the theist case as well. But the point I'm making is there's a lot more extra. That sounds like, but there's extra contingency in the theistic idealist worldview, because many more things are possible, right? So contingency is about one thing happens, but other things could have happened. So why did that thing happen? But many, many more things are possible in the theistic idealist world, because it's all in God's mind. He can think whatever he wants. That's just not true in the materialist worldview.
But extra contingency is not an issue. I mean, Graham Oppie,
it absolutely is an issue, because you need to explain why this and not that. That's the whole point of a theory, to provide explanatory power. And the theistic idealism doesn't, because it doesn't say why there's really any regularity at all. God could just imagine up whatever he likes. That needs to be explained, why we see what we do.
Once again, this goes back to the idea of an agent as the basis of the universe. It's not the only brute fact we're positing is namely God, and that of course he can create any sort of universe that he would want on that setting. But we don't have to just say that, oh well, the way he chose it is it did because of a brute fact. That's just a contingent outcome from an agent choosing certain things. So I don't understand where.
Yeah, but that needs to be explained as well. You can't just get around this by saying that, oh, God could choose whatever he wants. That's precisely the problem of the theory, that it doesn't account for why we see what we do see. And there's a much wider range of things that we could have seen, because God can do anything.
So, I mean, for you to posit a Zodiac killer killed a bunch of people, do you need to know all his thoughts or intentions? Or can you still say there was a killer regardless?
I'm just trying to see the connection there. So if I'm to postulate that someone did something, I need to appeal to their motivations or reasons for doing something.
But you know there was a Zodiac killer, even though we don't know his motivations.
Well, I don't really know anything about the Zodiac killer, but we maybe could know that. But that's not true. We always know things about people's motivations. We don't know anything about God's motivations. Well,
no, not necessarily. We have for example, so the Zodiac killer was a guy in the 60s and 70s, never caught, killed a bunch of people. He left notes and whatnot that people have deciphered over the years. Okay, we don't know why he did it necessarily, but we do know that there was one. So even Peter Lipton, for example, who's an atheist, says explanations do not themselves need to be understood. A drought may explain a poor crop, even if we don't understand why there was a drought. So positing a mind at the foundation does not mean I have to know all of the thoughts regarding that. That's just that's appealing to contingencies that aren't necessarily important when we're going to the necessary foundation.
Okay, so let me say this one more time, because I feel like we're talking in circles here. So what is a good theory supposed to do? A good theory should tell us why certain contingencies pertain and not others. That is, of the set of possibilities that could have happened, why this one? That's what we try to do in science. We say, look, I could have observed a whole bunch of different experimental results, but I saw this one, or maybe there's a couple that you saw, right? Why those? And we construct a theory that says that. It's similar, I think, in a philosophical theory. It says, why do we observe things, very broadly understood as observations? Why things appear to be the way they are, or are the way they are, right? And we construct a theory that says that. So that means that to be a good theory, we need to say why this and not something else. My contention is that there are some things that are unexplained under the sort of materialist theory that I'm advocating for, but they are much less than the things that are left unexplained under under theistic idealism, because everything could be different at any point in time and any point in space if God wanted his simulation to be that way. I'm not saying that an explanation needs to explain everything behind it. I'm saying that it's extremely implausible because it just doesn't explain anything. It just says they are the way they are because that's God's simulation. That's not a good explanation, because it could just equally be anything else, and the theory can't predict why this and not that. It's equally consistent with any possible outcome. That's my concern.
Well, first of all, we're talking about metaphysical theories. We're not talking about necessarily scientific theories.
So, yeah, I agree. I think it's the same in terms of how we. I don't think anything I've said is non-standard. That's how we evaluate the success of a theory, to be able to explain why certain things pertain and not others.
But you also said that on the materialist worldview, the laws of nature are the way just because they are. And then you also said the problem with theistic idealism is that the laws of the nature are the way they are because God willed it to be. I mean, you're just appealing to sort of
but they don't have to be. I feel like I've made my point. Now God can do anything, right? So literally anything that I postulate, you say, well, God could do that. Well, of course he could. But I think that's the problem with the God hypothesis, because as I said, any outcome, as long as it's logically possible, is equally consistent with the God hypothesis, because God can do anything. I think that's a weakness of the God hypothesis.
I mean, that's like saying because a computer programmer could program a simulation in a way he wants, he cannot be the explanation of a simulation. Just because
no, it would be a bad explanation to just say that. But it's also not true, because a computer program can't just program everything. Like, some things are incomputable, some things would have too much memory to program them, or we wouldn't know how to program them. So I don't think that actually relates to your computer analogy, which I think is.
But because an agent can do all sorts of different types of simulations, that does not mean the explanation is necessarily bad. Again, we don't need an explanation for the explanation, as you.
No, but it means that it doesn't explain anything. You keep going back to that. An explanation needs to account for why this and not other possibilities. If it doesn't do that, it's not an explanation. It's just a just so story. So if the explanation is equally consistent with all possible outcomes, it is not an explanation.
Again, let's just say there was a paranoid detective who would always posit Ted Bundy as the murderer in the 1970s, for example. I mean, just because Ted Bundy could always be the murderer doesn't mean he was never the murderer.
That's not an analogy. So it would be, well, I can't think of a better example than God, really. Whatever happens, you can say, oh, God did that. Why? Because God can do it, and as far as you know, would do it, right? Of course, you could postulate extra theology. You could postulate extra theology, which say, no, God wouldn't do this particular thing. Now you're getting a bit of explanatory value out of that. But just without any theology, just, okay, he's a perfect being, he can do anything. What's ruled out? But it doesn't seem anything's ruled out, so it can't explain anything. That's what explanations do. Why this, not what anything else it could have been.
But you're not a necessitarian, is it? So you do agree there's a probability of certain possible worlds out there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a wide range of possible worlds, even on your worldview. So I don't see that's how it's a problem here.
You jump in the gun. I'm not talking about why this reality and not others, right? That would be providing an explanation for, like, say, the laws of nature. I don't have an explanation for why the laws of nature are. So, if that's it, then you've got me there. But I don't think you do either, because why did God make these laws of nature in his simulation, not others? You don't have an explanation for that. So we're both on equal footing there.
Right, but I don't need that to posit a mind behind the universe as the most likely explanation given the data I presented.
Well, why do I need that if you need that? Sorry, why do I need that if you don't need that?
I'm not saying that. I'm
okay, well then that's fine. It's not. Okay. So you keep accusing me of having contingency at the basis of reality, which, I mean, I could appeal to something else that's...
No,
well, then what's the problem? What's the problem with what I'm saying? That God is not a good explanation because he doesn't explain why this and not others. And I'm not just talking about the origin of the laws of nature. I'm talking about literally anything that happens. Because God could make things completely different if he wanted to at any moment in time or any part of the universe. That doesn't follow from naturalism.
Okay, let's go back again. Okay, let's start over here. So you agree there's a huge possibility of all sorts of multiple worlds out there that could have been actualized. There's nothing about this world that means it's necessary. Okay, I'm not accusing
potentially.
You of saying,
I'm not committing myself to that, but yeah, sure, okay, let's go with that.
Yeah, I'm not accusing you of saying that there's contingency at the base of reality. I agree that you could just posit a necessary substance under there. Okay,
sure.
So what I'm trying to get at, though, is you're saying that because God could somehow have done certain things a certain way, that somehow or different ways, that's a problem for me. But you would also agree there's also this vast probability with regards to the possible worlds out there. So it's the same thing. I don't see why that's a problem for my worldview when it's not a problem for your worldview. It's just slightly different.
No, those I think are equivalent, right? To an extent, right? But the problem is, first of all, the space is larger for God. I mean, they're probably infinite, so it becomes... But God could create immaterial things, whereas I don't think those are possible. But more to the point, once things get going, I think that under naturalism, everything that follows is going to follow from the properties of what exists in reality. Maybe there's some chanciness to quantum events, but that's still describable using very particular laws, right? You can't just have any outcome. Whereas under theism, it seems anything goes, anything at least that's logically possible. So right, I'm not talking about the basis of the laws of nature or whatever. Yeah, okay, we're both going to say that that's contingent and we don't have an explanation for why this one, not the others. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, let's imagine that those have started off, if you like, the Big Bang's happened or whatever. Then what happens after that? I think I have a good explanation for why we see all these regularities in nature, because of all of these scientific theories that we give that describe the underlying properties or regularities of the material stuff that exists. I don't think you can appeal to that because God could just as easily make those not apply at any point in space or any point in time, or have immaterial things pop into being, or miracles. All of that's up for grabs in your worldview, and you don't have explanations for why it happens or doesn't happen at any point in time. I do, because those things are not consistent with the underlying nature of the material reality. So that's where the difference lies, not in the very beginning where these laws come from, but in how they play out.
Right, but I also agree there's regularities that are just not going to change willy-nilly. I don't understand why that's a problem for me, just because God could do it. Again, just because there's a possibility doesn't mean...
Because if God... No, but yeah, but that's the problem, right? No, it is a problem, because an explanation needs to say why one outcome and not others, or at least why a set of outcomes is more likely than the broader class. If theistic idealism can't do that, which you seem to say that it can't, then that's a problem. But, I mean, unless you believe that there's no miracles ever and God never intervenes, in which case it seems that he's not really doing very much. But if there are miracles, then you're going to say, oh, well, God sometimes intervenes, like he sometimes changes things. But then sometimes he doesn't, right?
Well, I don't think miracles are a violation of natural law. I did a whole video explaining that's not the case. I don't want to get into that. I don't want to. It doesn't matter if they're a violation of natural law or not. I don't think that's important. But then that doesn't threaten my view at all, because I'm agreeing there's regularities based on
because you need to explain why these outcomes are not others. Again, I feel like we're going in circles here. So